It seems to me that the predicament of Sri Lanka is entirely a predictable and understandable one, given the recent circumstances of conflict in the country. The conflict itself created expectations and possibilities, new possibilities that for the most part weren't realised. But the end of the conflict occurred in a way that wasn't the most constructive. It was a total victory for one side, rather than a negotiated compromise or settlement that would have allowed both sides to move together harmoniously. And I think that's a problem. In the post-conflict setting, it's always the case that there's a need for healing of some sort or another. There's a need for the two sides who have been estranged, who have been bitterly opposed, and civil wars are particularly violent and brutal, somehow to come together to re-establish the process of trust. And that's something that a government or an army can't do. That's something that has to be done at the level of the community itself.
Fortunately, in the context that we have today, we don't see a racial antagonism. That's something very, very hopeful for the country. It is just an incompetent government sitting on the top, unable to understand what reconciliation is, unable to understand the other side, and totally dysfunctional in Sri Lankan society that has caused this crisis. What is important is when we get together, follow the recommendations of the LLRC and put it through, and give confidence to the Tamil community that they are willing to get together and forget the past, bury the past altogether.
Could I just respond in the context of what I made before? I wouldn't support the government particularly, but I don't think it's the government's fault here. I think any government, good or bad, would be in the same position. There is always going to be a need for healing, and the healing processes have to occur at the community level, which are outside the reach of government. What the government needs to do is to recognise that it has to release its own controls and allow the communities to take over themselves. So government, good or bad, I think it's not the fault of the government, it's a process that is independent of any government here.
I think many of you talked about the government, the army, the situation of politics not moving forward for reconciliation. In my understanding, when the center is for any reason unable to move, it is very important that the margin moves. If the center, state, political institutions are not in situation to move towards reconciliation, you are so many Sri Lankans abroad. This is the margin. And I think the photo exhibition is an attempt, a space, a mindset of looking at that. What are the possibilities for the margin of Australian society, of Sri Lankan society, to emerge as a process of reconciliation that will have very limited effect because it is at the margin, but it can create a model. If we have a model created at the margin which has less structural barrier, then it is possible that this model could be replicated in different locations, including in Sri Lanka.
At the level of the community, I think there is evidence that people outside the north are working together. If you travel in other places, there's a good relationship, I think, that has developed and has been there even before between Tamils and Sinhalese. So one of the greatest things I think with asylum seekers or refugees is also the level of fear. Fear plays a much greater part than is often acknowledged. And I think whether it be politicians or other people working with refugees and asylum seekers and in communities, I think addressing fear is a much harder task. And I think some of the work that has been done in some places where people have overcome their fears, there has been both economic, psychological growth and much more unity.
So I think that the points that people are making around the construction of a post-conflict society are very pertinent here. I think the language that I use to frame this discourse is that this is about perceptions, and it's about the way that the community frames its responses to those perceptions, which are critical. I have a different perspective, and I think in fact government can lead on this, and government should lead on this. However, in the failure of government action, or in the face of government opposition to such action, then it's the responsibility of civil society to move towards those processes. I agree very much that it is the perception of fear, and the perception of fear is a very real perception of fear in the north and the east of the country. The very presence of the army within that context, the very presence of a government which is perceived to be hostile to the ambitions and to the hopes of those communities are what drives that fear, and is what I think is underpinning a considerable push.
So there's a lot of activity that is occurring at the community level, and there's been a resurgence of community-based activity within civil society, and I think this is a very healthy sign. It's part of the healing process, but clearly there are challenges, because the community healing process, that process of restoring trust, always comes up against the bitterness and division that is the legacy of 26 years of violent conflict. So I think the conversation here today illustrates how important it is for us to be able to listen to each other and to find ways past or through these old conflicts to allow or to release this process of community-based healing.
Well, I think within the community, of course, there are trends, where people want to reconcile, people want to be friendly, but if the political environment is not conducive for that, then there is a huge problem. Because in Sri Lanka, what has been happening, this is my private opinion, that they have been using divisions, dividing the communities on religious lines, on national lines, ethnic lines, to come to power. So they have been doing this, and I think it is going on now, and it has been sort of a barrier for the community to move forward. I know there are so many organizations, helping the reconciliation process, trying to do something constructively, at the ground level. But what happens if the political process does not allow that to proceed?